This is Sophie Morris, evaluator, trainer and consultant at Engagement with Impact, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Well, it's great to be co-hosting this Making an Impact special with Stella, our guest host for this episode. Sophie, we're really pleased to be speaking to you, and we're delighted to talk to you about evaluating impact. But before we get started, we like to get to know our guests a little bit. So if you could tell us a bit about your background and how you've got to the role that you're in today.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so my background is a bit of an interesting and unconventional one, some might say. So I like to think it kind of started with my own research career, sort of sitting in the lab, pipette in hand, many years ago. And as I sort of moved through that part of my career, I realized I was spending way more time out of the lab than in the lab. So very quickly realized that my future probably wasn't as a scientist, but in something else. And what I really valued was, I guess, taking research out of their conventional spaces and really trying to make an impact with them. So I moved into the public engagement sector from there. And I really, really enjoyed working with researchers to talk about their impact and finding ways to evaluate their impact. And I loved that so much that about 5 years ago, I decided to set up my own business, Engagement with Impact, where I run training and work with researchers to evaluate their impact. So yes, a bit of an interesting journey, but life does take you in very interesting ways.
Thank you, Sophie, for that. I mean, I'm really fascinated by your research and how you valued research in and out the lab. You talk also about going above and beyond the evaluation form when evaluating impact, right? But I was wondering, what does that mean and why is it important to do this?
Yeah, thanks, Stella. I think firstly, the really important thing to say is an evaluation form is an absolutely cracking way to evaluate impact. And I'm an absolute huge advocate for evaluation forms. I use them myself in a lot of work I do. But really, it's helping people see that there's a whole other range of things to do outside of the evaluation form. And that can be really important for lots of different reasons. For example, you could find evaluation tools that suit your audience better, that help answer your questions better, that might be better for you, less time consuming for your participants to fill in and take part in. So it's really about finding those creative ways and almost making evaluation a bit funner, more engaging, more interactive. So for example, a lot of stuff that I do might actually be part of an activity or an event. So it's not just a standalone evaluation, but it's actually part of something bigger, which can be really nice and a really powerful way to evaluate. So yeah, huge advocate for evaluation forms, but it's just about helping people think about other tools and techniques that are available to them as well.
Yeah, I also really like the idea that you said impact can represent something or being part of something bigger, right? But one of the fantastic things about modern research is actually the emphasis on collaboration and also interdisciplinarity, right? How can researchers utilize the networks or collaborators to create better evaluation techniques, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think being interdisciplinary and collaborating, it's huge across the research sector as a whole, right? And it's the same for your evaluation. If you're working with different people, with different views, opinions, experiences, then that can only make something richer. So I always encourage researchers to work with partners or collaborators because perhaps they've used a different technique before that's used really well with a specific audience. So you can kind of tailor a lot better to your different projects, I guess. So working with other people definitely brings those different experiences. They can also, the best thing to do with your evaluation is to plan it ahead of a project. And if you can plan that with your collaborators, then you're going to get so many more different ideas, options, experiences in the room. So yeah, huge advocate for working with partners and collaborators with your evaluation.
Yeah, you talked about different experiences, but I was wondering, I mean, impact assessment is challenging also because individuals, from researchers to policymakers to the general public, I mean, they all have different conceptions of impact.
Yeah.
What constitute positive impacts and meaningful contributions now and in the future? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's, again, something that you can work together with in collaboration, right? Because you're right, it means so many different things to different people. And even for researchers working on the same project, it can mean different things to different people in that project. So with a lot of work that I do with researchers, it's really nice if you're working with partners and collaborators to almost think about this from the beginning, right? And think about, what does impact mean to you? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to us? How are we going to reach it? How are we going to evaluate it? Because it will be different, because all of those different people are going to want and seek different things in a project. And that's only natural, really.
And what you just said, this idea of how, also connects to the idea of why researchers engage with impact. And this also connects to creativity in evaluation, right? Especially when we talk about impact. Creativity in evaluation may be quite novel to many researchers. Have you got an example you would love to share with us of how has been done successfully?
I guess firstly that I think whenever we talk to researchers about evaluation, I think they do just think it's going to be a whole host of evaluation forms, right? Oh, here's another form, here's another feedback form. I'm going to have 1 million feedback forms to analyze, and here's my impact. And what this is about is actually, like, at the onset of a project, thinking, what were we trying to achieve? What impact were we trying to achieve? Therefore, what actually are we trying to evaluate? What questions are we actually trying to answer? And then thinking, okay, if those are our questions, how can we answer them? Does it just have to be an evaluation form? Could it be, I don't know, sticky dots on chart? Could it be a graffiti wall? Could it be a word cloud? Could it be an interview or a focus group? And it's kind of turning that on its head, rather than thinking of evaluation as something that's just bolted on at the end, but thinking from the beginning, how can we be really creative with this? And how can we answer those questions that we're trying to find out in a creative, engaging and fun way? So, for example, in a lot of work that I do, it's around, maybe people's experience or knowledge has increased as a result of a project. It's just a case of gauging their knowledge at the start of that project and then gauging it at the end. And there are so many ways that you can gauge that. You can do it on a feedback form. Absolutely, that's a valid way. But you can have, maybe a chart saying, how confident do you feel in this topic on a scale from 1 to 4? Maybe they'll take a sticker and put it in a box at the beginning, and then they'd ask themselves the same question at the end. And what you might see is a shift or an increase in their confidence. And that's a really creative way to ask that same question that you might have just asked in an evaluation form. But it's really quick, it's really visual, it's really fun for the participants to do. You can gauge a response on the day as you see those dots shifting. So that's quite a nice tool that I see quite a lot being used if people just take that time to plan their evaluation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And going exactly using this word planning and plan, that usually these words kind of scare researchers, right? So many researchers consider evaluation as the final or the end part of a project. But as you just said, this is not the case. What's your suggestion to researchers on this topic, on this specific aspect?
Yeah, I think this is going to not go down well initially with the people listening to this, but it is to plan from the beginning, right? You know, for example, when you're thinking of your research project, perhaps you're putting your funding bid in, that is the time that you might want to think about your impact and also about how you're going to evaluate it, because we're all asked to think about our impact these days in our applications for funding. It's not going to go away. It's only going to come up more and more and more. And I think it's just taking that extra step of like, here's the impact we want to achieve, and actually, how are we going to capture it? And it's absolutely essential, because you can miss things just because you didn't plan for them. And actually, it could have been so easy to just, put up a sticky chart at one of your activities and gather some of that impact data. But if you only thought about evaluation at the end, then you completely missed out on that opportunity. Another huge problem that comes along are things like they might be running out of time on their funding grants, so they don't have time anymore to think about evaluation. Also, maybe they haven't thought about whether they need consent or not, or whether they need to go through some sort of university process or get some help and advice from people in the university team. So I think it's to start really embedding it as part of your impact, as part of your research funding grant from the beginning. And people are going to hate that because they're already asked to do so many different things. But I don't think it has to be a big, scary piece of work, If you think about what questions are we trying to answer, how are we going to answer them, it might only be 10 minutes of work each time. But that 10 minutes of work is going to absolutely mean that you can demonstrate what you've achieved, which is super, super important.
Talking about achievements and trying to apply impact to different fields and departments and faculties, what kind of differences in approaching evaluation forms did you experience?
I definitely feel that there's a disparity in my conversations across different disciplines. I think there's a common misconception, for example, that if you work in the sciences, that your research is way more impactful. You might get a patent and start a company or invent a healthcare intervention. And I think often researchers themselves feel like if, for example, they're in humanities and arts, that they can't achieve those same impacts. And my conversations there are always, it kind of links back to what we were saying earlier, like impact is such a huge thing and it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And obviously for someone, for example, my background was cancer immunotherapies, my impact was always to hopefully invent a cancer immunotherapy. So that was my goal, but that's going to be very different from someone who might work in the culture sector. For them, they might be really interested in improving, local culture and local heritage. So they're completely different impacts, but they're both completely valid. They're both completely demonstrable with evaluation, but the questions are going to be completely different, right? Because seeing whether a drug has been introduced and whether that's improved well-being is going to be very different evaluation to if, perhaps you've run a program, an outreach program, and you're trying to, improve the local heritage knowledge. They're very different impacts. They're going to be evaluated in very different ways. And the key there is to plan, right? Because as long as you have an idea of what your impacts might be, then you can plan your evaluation to capture those, whatever they might be. But yeah, those evaluation techniques and tools are going to be very different. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but hopefully it did.
Absolutely, Ashley. Impact assessment is quite challenging. Any suggestions to overcome these obstacles?
I think firstly, it's about being clear about what impact might mean to you as a researcher and to your research, right? Because how can you demonstrate something if you don't know what you're trying to demonstrate? So I think actually the question first that needs to be answered is what were you trying to achieve, right? So what does impact mean to you? What does it mean to you? Is it that, 100 people in your local community did something differently as a result of it? Is it that there was a new therapy? Is it that there's a new that? And I think that defining stage is often the hardest stage, right? What actual impact are we going for? What's important? What are we trying to achieve? And from there, it seems a lot more logical to then think, okay, well, how are we going to measure that? What tools and techniques are we going to use? What can we use? How long is this going to take? Is this a 5-year thing? Is this a 10-year thing? Is this a 1-year thing? Because that's all really important to say as well. Like for lots of researchers, their impact might not be realized for about 10 years or so. And that can be really daunting too. But what you might think is, the project is 3 years long, and in 3 years, we can evaluate this part or this much of what we've achieved. So it just goes back to that planning stage, really.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking that actually we really need to give more advice to researchers in order for them to embed this evaluation from the beginning to the end of the project. Mm-hmm. And finally, Sophie, thank you for all your answers, but these podcasts are being recorded as part of our Making an Impact 2023 series. Why do you think the evaluation of impact in research is so important for academics?
Very good question, Stella. I think it really comes down to that, as a researcher, as an academic, you're doing really, really amazing work. You're doing really amazing research. You're probably doing lots of other work outside of that to try and increase your impact. For example, through public engagement, through knowledge exchange, policy engagement, whatever. You're doing all these amazing things. And at the moment, without evaluation and without demonstrating exactly what they've achieved or, on the way to achieving, I think they're not quite getting what they need from, for example, REF, Research Excellence Framework. In the last round, there was a huge review on the fact that a lot of evaluation was missing. So people are saying they're doing all these things, but then, they're not quite getting the recognition that those things were actually achieved. And that can have knock-on effects for your career, perhaps, or whether, you feel the personal satisfaction that you need to feel to continue with those projects. It can really affect your motivation to continue. So by evaluating, it's kind of like you're being able to tick those boxes that you are being asked to fill. Quite, unfortunately, there's a huge debate about impact assessment and REF, but it is part of the culture that we work in. So it's about being able to demonstrate exactly what you've achieved and therefore get what you need out of that process for you as a researcher. It's also about celebration, right? Because people are doing all these amazing things, and without evaluating, you don't have those moments to check in and go, wow, like, look what we achieved by doing this. Look what we've done. Let's celebrate, pat on the back. And obviously then evaluation plays a huge role in learning, reflecting what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we change for next time? Are we going to work with the same people? Are we going to do the same things? So yeah, so many different reasons why it's so important. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sophie and Stella. That was such an interesting conversation. And I know the listeners will get a great deal from listening to the conversation that you both had there. This podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast, and we like to finish each recording with 3 or 4 take-home tips that our listeners can reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So, Sophie, if you could give us a few tips or thoughts to reflect on in relation specifically to how we ensure we evidence and evaluate impact, what would they be?
Thanks, Alex. I think firstly, I've said it so many times throughout, but it's to plan, right? Not just to bolt that evaluation on. And the reason for that, firstly, is because it can be super, super powerful to gather a baseline of where you're at with what you're trying to measure. And by a baseline, I mean, for example, if you want to see if people's skills have increased as part of something, it's to measure what level their skills are at the start. And then you can measure again at the end. And what that does is hopefully gives you an idea of an actual change that's happened as a direct result of your activity or project. So yeah, tip number one is to gather that baseline data or information. The second one is kind of linked to that. It's that timeliness of evaluation is also really, really important. So as well as that baseline and gathering data straight after, if you're looking for a longer term change or impact, it might be that you have to follow back, circle back around in a year's time or 3 years' time or 5 years' time. And so just to be mindful of that as well. And again, if you've planned for that, then that won't be such a shock or difficult to get to grips with. So gather baseline data, think about the timeliness. Thirdly, which was my favorite one, is to incorporate your evaluation as much as you can as part of the project or activity or event that you're delivering. So rather than thinking, I'm just going to send a feedback form afterwards, plonk that on at the end, you can actually do some really interesting and innovative things as part of an activity. You get much higher response rates, often as high as 100%. And it can also be a really interactive and engaging activity for your audience to take part in. So that can also enhance their experience as well. And lastly is just to have fun. I think evaluation and impact are huge. They're hugely triggering words, I think, in the culture that we work in. And it can almost feel quite daunting and overwhelming. But actually, it doesn't have to be that way. Evaluation can be super fun, super engaging. So as much as you can, be creative and have fun with your evaluation.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.